The talks are over, the threat is public, and one of the world's most important oil routes is now at the center of a dangerous showdown.
What if one announcement from Donald Trump could send shockwaves through oil markets, shake the Middle East, rattle world shipping, and push the United States one step closer to a much bigger confrontation with Iran? Because that is exactly what just happened. After failed talks, Trump declared that the U.S. would begin blockading ships tied to Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping lanes on Earth. And then came the threat. Not diplomacy, not de-escalation. A threat. Trump warned that anyone firing at U.S. forces or peaceful vessels would be, in his words, blown to hell. That is not routine language. That is escalation language. So tonight, we need to answer one question. Is this a pressure tactic designed to make Iran back down, or the opening move in something far bigger? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this moment matters far beyond Iran, far beyond America, and maybe far beyond the Strait of Hormuz itself. And I want your opinion early. Do you think this is strength or a dangerous gamble? Comment strength or gamble right now. Here's what happened. Donald Trump announced that the U.S. Navy would begin blockading ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. And he also said vessels that paid what he called an illegal toll to Iran would not have safe passage, even on the high seas. That line alone changed the tone immediately. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not some random waterway. This is the artery through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and major LNG shipments move. When Hormuz shakes, the world feels it. Fuel prices feel it. Shipping feels it. Inflation feels it. Politics feels it. But then came a major clarification. U.S. Central Command later signaled that this would not mean stopping every ship in the entire strait. Instead, the enforcement would focus on vessels going to and from Iranian ports. That is still huge. It is still provocative. It is still dangerous. But it is not exactly the same as fully sealing off the entire waterway. And that difference matters. Because in crises like this, one word can move markets. One sentence can move fleets. And one badly framed statement can move nations toward conflict. So in this video, I'm going to break down 3 things. What Trump actually said, what the US appears ready to do, and why this may be one of the most explosive moments in the Iran crisis so far. And trust me, the most important part is not the headline. It is what happens next. Let's start with the rhetoric, because words matter here. Trump did not sound cautious. He did not sound diplomatic. He sounded defiant, personal, and confrontational. First, he framed the move as immediate. Second, he warned that ships paying Iran would be treated as part of the problem. Third, he went even further and threatened that any Iranian who fired at U.S. forces or peaceful vessels would be blown to hell. That is not just strategic messaging. That is a public red line. And here is why that matters. When a president speaks like that in the middle of an already volatile military standoff, every actor starts recalculating. Tehran recalculates. The Gulf recalculates. Oil traders recalculate. Insurance markets recalculate. Tanker operators recalculate. U.S. allies recalculate. This is no longer just about whether Iran is charging ships, threatening ships, or pressuring the strait. Now it becomes a credibility contest. If Trump talks this big, can he afford to back down? If Iran is challenged this openly, can it afford to look weak? And if both sides think backing down makes them look weaker, then the crisis becomes far more dangerous. That is how escalation works. Not always through one missile. Sometimes through ego, pride, and public commitment. And that may be the scariest part of all. Because once leaders lock themselves into maximum language, they shrink their own off-ramp. And let me ask you this. If a leader makes a threat that bold in public, does he still have room to compromise in private? Tell me in the comments, can Trump still de-escalate after saying this? Yes or no? Now, if you really want to understand why this story is exploding, you need to understand Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically valuable choke points on the planet. A narrow corridor, a small space, but with massive consequences. Roughly 20% of global oil trade flows through it. That means if shipping there slows down, energy markets don't wait for the full war to begin. They react instantly. And they already are. Oil prices moved sharply higher after this latest escalation. Brent climbed above the $100 mark. US crude surged too. That tells you everything. Markets do not hear military blockade and stay calm. Why? Because it is not just about whether ships can physically pass. It is about fear. Fear of mines, fear of drones, fear of missile attacks, fear of miscalculation, fear that commercial shipping companies will simply decide the risk is too high. And once fear enters the shipping lane, traffic can freeze even before a full military clash happens. That is why this is bigger than a Trump headline. This is about the price of energy, the cost of transport, political pressure in the West, and whether the crisis spills into a global economic shock. So when people say this is just another Middle East standoff, no, it is not just that. This is one of those moments where a narrow stretch of water suddenly becomes the center of the world. Now let's move from statements to actions, because this is where things become real. Reports indicate that US military planning has already moved beyond rhetoric. American forces have been setting conditions for mine-clearing operations. 2 US destroyers were reported to have transited the strait ahead of that effort. And Central Command said enforcement connected to Iranian ports would begin on a defined timetable. That means this is not just political theater anymore. A blockade is not a tweet. A blockade is not a press conference. A blockade is an operation. And operations create contact. Contact creates friction. Friction creates incidents. And incidents create war scares. Because think about what enforcement actually means. What happens if a vessel ignores instructions? What happens if it carries cargo for a major power? What happens if a warning shot is misunderstood? What happens if Iran sends fast boats, drones, or indirect pressure through regional proxies? What happens if a commercial captain panics? What happens if one missile, one mine, or one mistaken radar lock changes everything? This is why military experts are warning that even a limited blockade is a massive, open-ended endeavor, not a neat, clean move with a guaranteed outcome. And that should concern everyone. Because the public often hears a phrase like blockade and imagines control. But real-world blockades do not mean control. They often mean prolonged tension, legal disputes, naval stress, unpredictable escalation, and constant opportunities for something to go wrong. So yes, the language is aggressive, but the acts now matter more. And the acts tell us this crisis has entered a far more serious phase. If you're still watching, here's the key point so far. This is no longer just about what Trump said. It is about whether America can actually enforce pressure on Iran without triggering the exact wider conflict it claims to be trying to prevent. And that leads to the next critical question. Is Iran intimidated or provoked? Because the answer to that question decides almost everything. Iran's response has been exactly what you would expect from a state that sees leverage in Hormuz and humiliation in public threats. Iranian messaging has made 2 things clear. First, Tehran wants the world to know it still sees the strait as an area where it has power. Second, it is signaling that military vessels approaching under hostile conditions could be treated as a ceasefire breach and met harshly. That is a warning, and warnings at sea are never casual. Because unlike land battles, where lines are clearer, maritime standoffs live in ambiguity. A move can be defensive to one side and offensive to the other. A patrol can be read as pressure. A warning can sound like a countdown. This is where crises become most dangerous, in the gray zone between message and misfire. Iran also understands something else. Its direct conventional power may be pressured, but its leverage in Hormuz is psychological as much as military. Tehran does not need to sink half the world's tankers to create chaos. It only needs enough uncertainty to make insurers nervous, traders anxious, and shippers cautious. That is the game. Raise the cost, raise the fear, raise the pressure. Force the world to ask whether confronting Iran is worth the economic fallout. And if Trump's objective is to break Iran's leverage, Tehran's objective is to prove it still has leverage. That is why neither side wants to look weak. And that is why this moment is so combustible. Now let's talk politics, because this is not happening in a vacuum. Trump himself has acknowledged that oil and gasoline prices could remain high through the US midterm election season. That is a remarkable admission, because it means even he understands the domestic risk. This is where the story gets even more interesting. Trump is trying to project strength. He wants to look decisive. He wants to look unafraid. He wants to look like the man willing to do what others would not. But the political cost of that posture can rise fast if Americans start feeling the crisis at the pump. And here is the problem with energy shocks. They are global in cause, but local in pain. People do not debate maritime strategy while filling their cars. They just see higher numbers. So Trump is gambling on something very specific, that projecting force now will produce results before the public punishes the economic cost. That is a high-risk bet. Because if Iran does not bend quickly, if shipping disruption continues, if prices stay high, if the crisis drags on, then the image of strength can start turning into the image of overreach. And once that happens, every aggressive statement begins to look less like control and more like entrapment. That is why this moment matters politically as much as strategically. Trump is not only testing Iran, he is also testing time. Can he force an outcome before the consequences catch up to him? That may be the real contest. I want to pause here and ask you something important. If gas prices keep rising, will voters still support a hardline move like this? Write yes or no in the comments. I genuinely want to see where people stand on this. Another huge detail many people are missing: not everyone is lining up behind this approach. The UK has already made clear it is not joining the US blockade of Iranian ports. Britain says it wants the strait reopened, not further militarized through direct participation in a blockade. That matters a lot. Because when America acts in a crisis like this, the global question is not only, can the US do it? It is also, who stands with the US if this gets worse? If key allies hesitate, the message changes. Instead of broad coalition pressure, it begins to look more like Washington carrying the burden and the blame alone. At the same time, every country that depends on Gulf energy is watching nervously. China is watching. India is watching. Europe is watching. Asian importers are watching. Gulf states are watching. Nobody wants Hormuz to become a long-term battlefield, because if that happens, the damage will not be measured only in military terms. It will be measured in inflation, supply stress, insurance costs, shipping delays, and global political instability. So yes, Trump's words were dramatic. Yes, the military steps are serious. But the wider world is sending a quieter message. Open the waterway. Do not turn it into a permanent crisis zone. And the fact that even close partners are trying to avoid getting pulled into the blockade tells you how dangerous this looks from the outside. So what comes next? There are really only a few paths. The first is that Iran blinks. Shipping pressure works. Tension cools. Trump claims victory. Markets settle down. And this becomes one of those moments where brinkmanship produced leverage. But that is only one path. The second path is prolonged standoff. No dramatic explosion. No immediate full war. Just a grinding, expensive, nerve-wracking confrontation with constant risk and no clean resolution. And honestly, that may be the most realistic short-term outcome. Then there is the third path, the one everyone fears. An incident, a strike, a mine, a misread maneuver, a vessel challenged too aggressively, a retaliatory move, a chain reaction. And suddenly, what began as pressure becomes a broader military confrontation that no one fully controls. That is the danger with big declarations in fragile environments. You may intend to send a message, but history may hear a starting gun. So let's bring this all together. Trump's latest statements on Hormuz were not ordinary campaign-style soundbites. They were aggressive, strategic, and highly consequential. The actions that followed, military preparation, enforcement language, and a defined blockade posture toward Iranian ports, show this is not just rhetoric anymore. But here is the bottom line. A blockade can project power. It can also expose limits. A threat can intimidate. It can also trap the person making it. And in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, the line between deterrence and disaster is dangerously thin. This is why the world is paying attention. Because if this move works, Trump will say he forced the issue. If it fails, the costs could spread far beyond the Gulf. And now I want your final verdict. Is Trump forcing Iran toward a deal, or pushing the region toward a bigger war? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading them. If you want more sharp, fact-based breakdowns on global power, conflict, and the stories behind the headlines, subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and stay with this channel. Because the next phase of this crisis could change everything. And trust me, this story is far from over.